presentation on sea level rise, and I really want to thank him for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thanks, Mary, for the opportunity to address this esteemed board. This is work that was funded by the Coastal Conservancy in part, as well as the Coastal Commission, the Ocean Protection Council, CNRA. So the state has been a huge supporter of a lot of what I'm going to talk about. So huge thanks, state, for really taking the lead in funding research and putting logic first in your decision making, unlike the reference to Florida, for example. So I really appreciate how the state has really gotten behind cutting edge research. So I'm going to try and provide a fairly concise summary of the latest in sea level rise and storm research and projections, and try to do that through a coastal resilience lens. And this is work that's been done in collaboration with a number of different groups, including Deltaris, Netherlands, Point Blue Conservation Science, and universities up and down the California coast. So a huge group underneath my name here. Really, the list could go, in the dozens and dozens. So just to keep that in mind. Next slide, please. We're going to click through a bunch of them fairly quickly here. So, storm impacts have affected the California coast forever, and it's been most acute since we began to develop the coast. So these sorts of impacts like we experienced recently are not that unusual, except that everything is now riding on top of the 8 to 12 inches of sea level rise we've experienced since the early 20th century. Next slide, please. These effects are most noticeable during El Nino storm winter seasons. We have much larger waves, higher water levels. But what we're seeing, you can keep clicking through just every few seconds here. We're seeing more and more now, though, is not just during El Nino winters, but we're also seeing impacts during normal winter storms as well. An increase in the frequency and magnitude of coastal flooding and impacting infrastructure and people's lives. Next slide, please. And this is just an example in Santa Cruz of a road that used to be flooded maybe every 10 years to 20 years. Now we're seeing overtopping almost every year because, like I said, we're riding on top now of a higher base level of 8 to 12 inches of sea level. Next slide, please. And this is happening up and down the coast, and we saw this significantly during this last series of storms. We had significant coastal flooding in Southern California on the left, Northern California on the right. And this is, a sign of what's to come. What was essentially maybe a once in a decade event, because it's now riding on top of sea level rise of, maybe as much as a foot. This becomes a once in a lifetime event. And so, we're going to see these sorts of things happen more and more frequently as sea level rise continues to accelerate. And so this is basically a window into the future of what we can expect to happen more frequently, and we need to plan appropriately for these sorts of impacts because they are going to get worse in the absence of action. Next slide, please. And, right in your backyard there in Imperial Beach, it's not just during storms, but also high tides, especially spring high tides and king tides. There's parts of the state where we're seeing flooding on a very regular basis. And this is because we've developed our entire civilization along this super dynamic margin, the coastal interface, which is prone to significant changes and storms. And it's no surprise that especially in all these reclaimed estuaries, like in the Imperial Beach area, like Mission Beach, Mission Bay, like San Francisco Bay, we put people in harm's way. So, right, there's no hazards unless people are in the way. So it's a significant problem and something that, we're grateful to have agencies like the Coastal Conservancy addressing these in a holistic way. Next slide, please. This is not just a California problem. You can just click through about 4 slides here. This is a national problem. It's a global problem. We're seeing this in the Pacific Northwest. We're built right up to the margin. Next slide, please. We're seeing this in the Northeast. Again, all these impacts are most noticeable during significant storms like hurricanes. Next slide, please. The Southeast as well, most recently during Hurricane Dorian, which decimated some of the Outer Banks. Next slide, please. New Orleans, and the greater Louisiana Gulf Coast area has been affected by a number of hurricanes recently. Next slide, please. And it's not just, significant storms, but again, high tide flooding in places like Miami are the norm now in some neighborhoods. And, we see some of these impacts in California as well, though we're not as low lying, but we can expect more of this in the future as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to try and give a little synopsis on the latest observations and then talk a little bit about the impacts. So, by whatever metric you look at, no matter what meteorological organization you follow, shown on the right is the dramatic increase in global mean temperature over the last century or so. The past 9 years have been the 9 warmest years on record. And another tidbit I ran across yesterday is that the last 46 years consecutively have all been warmer than the average temperature in the 20th century. So that should tell you that this is not an anomaly. Things are happening, they're happening rapidly, and they're largely human driven, if not completely human driven. And another, out of the 6th assessment report, they reported recently that global surface temperatures have increased faster since 1970 than any 50-year period over at least the last 2 millennia. That's a fairly conservative body. You look at the proxy record, back at least 20,000 years, and the rate of increase in temperature today is about 70 times faster than any time in the last 20,000 years. So it's very rapid. And, this translates then to higher sea levels and more rapid sea level rise. And that sea level has quadrupled since the early 20th century. That rate of sea level rise has tripled since the 70s and doubled since the 90s. So things are happening, they're happening rapidly, they're accelerating, and this is why we're seeing an increase in the magnitude and frequency of coastal hazard impacts. And it's not going to stop. We're committed to at least 6 feet of sea level rise over the next several centuries. Even if we stopped emitting today, we know that's not happening. 125,000 years ago, we were 2 degrees Celsius warmer across the globe, and that equated to 25 feet higher sea level rise. So once the whole system equilibrates, we can expect maybe over centuries, maybe a millennia, to have a huge amount of sea level rise coming down the pike, even if we restrict things now. So coastal adaptation really is the order of the day, and looking at solutions for how to do that holistically. Next slide, please. So I've just kind of binned all the different sea level rise projections here, the institutional projections that are based on consensus building. The most prominent one at the global level is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the United Nations body, consisting of hundreds of scientists that every 4 to 5 years release definitive authoritative reports on global climate change. The last one came out in 2021. But because of the nature of this body, it's fairly conservative. It's more of a least common denominator approach. And as you can see from the right-hand top plot, the projections out to 2100, this is in meters, but are effectively, the range is about 1.5 to 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. And that's very much on the low end if you look at the peer-reviewed literature and the other bodies and their projections. At the national scale, and this is a group that I co-chaired for the last report, is the Sea Level Rise Interagency Task Force. And this is comprised of 10 federal agencies and about 30 scientists. And we put out a tech report last February. Those projections are in the middle panel on the right. And these are these do pull from AR6, but they're a little bit more aggressive and are able to leverage some of the latest science a little bit more effectively. And so you see the range there is more on the order of about 0.5 meter to over 2 meters of sea level rise by 2100. So basically about 1.5 feet to about 6 to 7 feet or so. And so that's a little bit of a wider range, but a higher end projections for the more extreme scenarios. And at the state level, in the state of California has really led the charge in terms of state level projections. And this has been done through the Ocean Protection Council and the Ocean Science Trust. The last report was back in 2017. And this is typically an ad hoc group of experts. And really the benefit of that is that the state is able to pull the experts who are leading the way in science and thought on sea level rise and adaptation and get together a group fairly quickly. They don't need a consensus of hundreds and hundreds of scientists like IPCC. So they're really able to kind of push the boundaries and really assimilate the latest science and get that into the projections. And that report came out back in 2017. The projections were in the range of about 1/2 foot to maybe about 4.5 feet, and sort of the median ranges based on emission scenarios. But then there's also an H++ scenario, which considered ice sheet instability and put the upper end of sea level rise at about 10 feet potentially by 2100. Now, the new report is coming in 2023, co-chairing that report with Laura Engelman at California Sea Grant and Scripps, and then also Ben Hamilton at NASA. And this is going to adopt the approach of the National Sea Level Rise Interagency Task Force into more of a scenario approach and pull the latest science from that group and then have it downscaled and refined for the state of California. So you can go on to the next slide, please. I'm just going to talk a little bit about that national report because this is essentially the format and the style of what's coming for California in the fall of 2023 when that report is released, which we're writing up now. So this interagency body at the federal level was formed about 8 years ago. It sits under the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House through a couple of groups, United States Global Change Research Program and the Subcommittee on Ocean Science and Technology. And the idea is to bring together the best scientific expertise across the federal landscape as well as academics to produce the best sea level rise science possible. The last report consisted of a couple dozen authors from several federal agencies and 3 universities. And there's a link to that. All these slides will be available, so you don't need to copy those down. Next slide, please. And so just want to summarize what's in this report. It provides scenarios out to 2150. And one of the big additions and the big benefits of this approach is that it also includes not just model projections, but observation-based projections. So it pulls from 70 years of tide data from all the available tide gauges and uses that trend to project out to 2050. And as it turned out, that trend agrees very well with roughly the intermediate projections from just the models themselves. So it provides a lot of confidence that the observations are matching up with the models, and especially out to 2050. So there's a lot more confidence with that approach. The scenarios are updated with the latest science from IPCC. As I mentioned, it has this really nice comparison between models and observations, and there is an increased focus on mid-century where we have more confidence in the projections, which are less reliant on the potential range of emission scenarios and some of the uncertainty in how the ice sheets are going to respond. The other important thing to note is that what we have done at the national level and are planning to do at the state level is that we have dropped the extreme scenario, which you might consider that H++ sort of ice sheet instability scenario. Only because based on the latest science out of Antarctica, it's unlikely, extremely unlikely, less than a 1% chance that we will get to 10 feet of sea level rise, for example, by the end of the century. Although on our current emissions trajectory, we're likely to get there by potentially the middle of the next century or sooner. But the likelihood of having that sort of an equal presentation among the other scenarios is just not scientifically accurate, so that was dropped. Okay, next slide, please. So finally, this is just a kind of way to crosswalk these scenarios with different emissions, and really the take-home message from here is that while there's these 5 different scenarios from this report, and it'll be very similar for what's coming for California, there's not specific probabilities assigned to them. However, we know that for these lower scenarios, they really require low emissions and low warming trajectories, whereas the higher scenarios require higher emissions and higher warming and potential rapid ice sheet loss. So we really can't get to these higher scenarios, such as 2 meters targeted for 2100 without significant ice sheet instability and high emissions. That's really the main thing to take away from this plot. The biggest uncertainties in the sea level rise projections, the science is getting better and better. One is that we don't know what emissions trajectory we're going to take over the next century. And number 2, there's still uncertainty in terms of how the ice sheets are going to respond. That's really the big unknown. We know that there's about 220 feet of equivalent sea level captured in Antarctica, but how quickly that ice sheet can disintegrate and then contribute to sea level rise is highly unknown, and that's one of the big reasons why there's such a large range. However, the best science suggests that we're going to have, basically 2 feet of sea level rise is pretty much baked into the system by 2100, no matter what we do. And the upper end of these projections is about 6.5 feet, but that will be adjusted for California based on regional considerations. Next slide, please. And then lastly, just to some kind of the main take-home messages here that we've experienced at the national level roughly a foot of sea level rise over the last century. We're going to get about a foot over the next 30 years. That's the bottom line. It's a very tight agreement between the observations-based projections and the models, and a very small and much smaller range across the scenarios than there was in the past. So bottom line is what we've experienced over the last 100 years, we're probably going to get in about the next 30 years across the country and also for California. Next slide, please. Okay, so, and this is just the range. I've already discussed this. We're looking at, about 2 to 7 feet, 6.5, 7 feet by the end of the century. But again, 2100 is not a brick wall. Things will continue. They'll continue to accelerate most likely. And so by 2150, we can be starting to get into that H++ type of scenario. And I talked about some of these uncertainties already, so we can just go on to the next slide in the interest of time. And so what can we expect from the sea level rise? At the global level, could potentially impact on the order of 300 million people and about $14 trillion in assets over the next century. In California, through the support of the state and the work that we've done, we've projected that the higher scenarios of about 6.5 feet could impact 600,000 people and about $200 billion in property by the end of the century, and that accounts for about 6% of GDP. Now, all these numbers I'm providing are in the absence of coastal management, planning, adaptation, action. So it's a bit of a doomsday scenario, but hopefully it can help sort of facilitate action and to think about solutions so this will not be our future. So sea level rise will likely cause the once in a lifetime coastal flooding events to occur annually by the middle of the century and every day by 2100. And this is because for every 2 to 4 inches of sea level rise, the flood risk doubles. And for California, that's more on the order of about every 2 inches or so. So effectively, we've increased our flood risk 16 times over based on the 8 inches of sea level rise we've experienced in the California coast over the last century. So that flood risk dynamic is changing significantly with just small amounts of sea level rise. But it's not just sea level rise. When we consider storms and coastal change, about 3 times more people will be at risk. So bathtub modeling is not the way of the future. We have to dynamically model storms along with sea level rise and coastal change to understand the future vulnerability of California. Next slide, please. So how's this going to affect the coast? Well, we can expect more frequent and severe coastal flooding, increased rates of beach and bluff failures, something that's just been talked about a little bit more recently and getting to the public eye, the fact that rising water tables and saltwater intrusion will be a major factor along the coast. And ecosystems are continually going to be squeezed between rising seas and development. And as has been discussed already during this meeting, there will be a disproportionate impact on underserved communities. So environmental justice is really a key lens to look through as we look toward the future, because a lot of these communities need to be engaged equitably and provide their feedback and perspectives on how we're going to plan for climate change and be a part of that process. What the state has really done an excellent job is, I think, through their funding of some of this work, is making this information available to all communities, not just a bunch of one-off studies across the state, but providing the support to us and other agencies so that we can provide consistent authoritative guidance across the whole state, regardless of local resources. And that's really been a huge boost and something that California, I think, should be really proud of. Next slide, please. I'm going to summarize now the impacts and how the USGS has addressed these projections and translated them into what this means to society. Number of state agencies, as I mentioned before, have supported the development of the coastal storm modeling system, which we began back in about 2005, and it's now been applied across the entire state. We're just wrapping up a few items in Northern California, but the rest of the state is covered and all the information is available and accessible. The general concept is to take the latest global climate models and then feed those through a series of regional and local models that transform surge and waves and tides across the shelf, across the surf zone, onto the shore, and then provide highly detailed, locally relevant flood risk, coastal hazard risk in terms of shoreline change and cliff retreat and groundwater hazards as well, and put those up into easily accessible web tools, such as was developed by Point Blue Conservation Science, which I'll talk about in just a second. And this is really the key too, through that environmental justice lens, is that it's really easy to make information available, but if no one is aware of it, it's not going to be accessible or actionable. And that's something that we've really put a lot of effort into in the last 5 years or so, is trying to make that bridge between just spitting something out and putting on a website so it's technically available, but that doesn't translate to accessibility. Slide, please. So what we've done is integrated all the key oceanographic components that drive coastal hazards. So the waves, the rivers, storm surge, sea level, tides, etc. We've provided all the key sea level rise projections. In this case, now we're lining up everything with the new federal guidance, which is also effectively going to be the California guidance. So from 0 to 3 meters of sea level rise. So we have some higher end scenarios as well, but all these line up really nicely with the federal guidance. And then in the end of the day, we have this combined with different storm conditions, daily conditions, and conditions, 20-year, 100-year conditions, a total of 28 core scenarios, and all those have been translated into these hazard zones. Next slide, please. And so this is served up through the Our Coast, Our Future tool, which was developed in partnership with Point Blue Conservation Science. It's a very easy tool to access. It's Google Earth based. You select whichever scenarios you want on the left-hand side here. You select whatever hazards you want, and then you start clicking through scenarios. And what people typically do is go to their favorite beach from childhood or their home and start clicking through scenarios to look at the impacts, what the tipping points are based on different sea level rise and storm conditions. So please click through just 5 times or so, and you'll see this area of Sunset Beach and how the flood risk changes with different sea level rise and storm scenarios. And I think, yes, and there's probably a bit of a delay on my end, but yeah, if you just click through about 4 times or so, you'll see the increase in flood risk as we add sea level rise and add different storms. And this has really helped communities plan for the timing of where impacts are going to become significant. But this is just a small part of the picture. To really translate this information into the policy world, we developed the Hazard Exposure Reporting Analytics tool called HERA. And what this does is really put dollars and lives into the equation of what these scenarios really mean. And so now we know for all of urban California, you can click through here with an upper end scenario of 2 meters of sea level rise and a 100-year storm. You know, this you can click through a couple more times. This equates to, as I mentioned before, about 500,000 people and $200 billion in property at risk over the next century. And this is what was featured in California's 4th climate assessment. And this is what was used by the state legislature as what I've been told, a crowbar to pass the $4 billion climate resilience spending package. So it's really important that we have this information to really move the needle at those higher levels. Now, that's flooding. Coastal change is another aspect. What's going to happen to our beaches? Well, you know, rising sea level is going to drive shorelines further inland. And this is going to increase a whole variety of impacts, both physical, ecological, and economic. We can build out beaches during sea level rise. However, that requires more sediment into the system. It requires beach nourishment. It requires the cliffs to be able to erode. I can go back. Sorry, one more. I think it clicked through on its own for some reason. And so it's really critical that we get more sand on beaches. Unfortunately, we're going the opposite direction. We've built dams up and down the coast. And this has reduced sediment supply in Southern California by about 50% to the coast. And so this is causing, even more of an issue, because not only is sea level rising, but we're getting less sand in the system as well. And we're basically drowning beaches. And we've put this line of sand across so much of the state. We've basically reinforced the back shore. We've built revetments, we've built seawalls, and that does not allow the coast to naturally migrate. And so this effectively drowns beaches. And this is a huge issue moving forward. And now going through is just fine. And so with the modeling that we've done, you can let it click through to the slide, sorry. Perfect, thank you. And so what this has done, we've done a lot of modeling of beaches and cliff retreat, and what we found is that in the absence of action, we could effectively lose about half of Southern California beaches by the end of the century, because the beaches are migrating landward, but there's hard infrastructure that doesn't allow the beaches to migrate, and so they're being drowned. The cliffs, with sea level rise, we can expect an increase in cliff retreat by about 50% or so over the next century. And we know that cliffs, especially in Southern California and parts of the Central Coast and Northern California, are extensively developed. And so we need a solution to be able to curb those retreat rates or to get people out of harm's way. Next slide, please. And I'm getting close to the end here. I think I had about 25 minutes, so I'm almost there. So the other major factor, which we've been addressing recently, and a lot of this was based on stakeholder feedback, is the groundwater issue. And so the ground is saturated very close to the surface near the coast, because the groundwater levels are influenced heavily, controlled by sea level, as well as recharge and the geology itself. So this is just a look at a schematic of what the coast looks like today. We have that saltwater wedge there at depth. Maybe we have a berm. This beach berm could be a dune, it could be infrastructure, what have you. But then if you click through, this is the scenario with sea level rise. That beach is going to migrate inland. That water table is going to go up as well. And even if we have a structure in place, whether it's a natural structure like a beach berm or a dune, or a hard structure like a seawall, that water table is still going to go up, and it's going to flood areas inland, even potentially before parts of the beach are underwater. And so we developed a statewide assessment of this particular hazard as well. And this is also served up in that tool. Next slide, please. And this is an example from the Goleta area. And here you see Santa Barbara showing in the warm colors where the groundwater table is projected to be very close or at the surface with sea level rise. And again, not surprisingly, a lot of these hot spots are in areas that were once tidal marshes, estuaries across the state that are very low lying and very susceptible to hazards in any case. Next slide, please. And so this is a major issue that we have to consider together with overland flooding and coastal change as well. You can click through a few times. The big question is, what are these impacts going to be from groundwater? We know what the exposure is now. You can go back, perfect, thank you. We know what the exposure is going to be, and we've looked at this across the state. The exposure of shallow groundwater is almost 10 times higher than overland flooding across the state. So we're talking about 4 million residents potentially exposed to shallower groundwater in the next century because of this factor. But how that translates to impacts is still part of ongoing research. But we do know that when we have higher water table, basements flood, structures weaken like roadbeds, foundations are undermined, pollutants are liberated, underground utilities are compromised, such as fiber optic cables, such as gas lines, such as electrical lines, and we need to have a better understanding of how this shallower water table can translate to impacts. The other major issue is septic systems. So there's a lot of coastal communities that are all in septic, and all of a sudden when you have a saturated leaching field, those septic systems are no longer functional. And this has been a huge issue in places like Stinson Beach. Currently, there's a lot of work going on in this realm on the East Coast, places like the Outer Banks, where almost everybody's on septic systems, and those are failing now, where they're experiencing higher rates of sea level rise than we are. Next slide, please. So the typical response to sea level rise, there's generally 4 of them. One is retreat, managed realignment, whatever we'd like to call it. We know retreat is a very, very bad word in the state of California right now and doesn't like to be discussed, but that's one solution. And then the other solution is to go vertical, to elevate. Another one is to go gray and defend the coast. This might be the New York, Manhattan example, for example, or New Orleans example. And then the other solution is more of a restore approach, a nature-based solution. Maybe we combine green and gray solutions, or we go fully onto something like a vegetated levee, for example, or building up beach and dune systems and do it in a more natural way. Next slide, or just click through. But this does not account for the groundwater issue. And these solutions say nothing about groundwater. They're all oblivious to the rising water tables. And so we have to think strategically about how to address coastal impacts with all these different hazards to consider. And it's not an easy conversation to have, but they have to occur. Next slide, please. And the other issue is we have all these sensitive ecosystems across the coast, tidal marshes, wetlands, that are really pinned in by development. And this is an example from Carpinteria, which is really an example we see across the state of these sorts of systems, that they're really pinned in by infrastructure, whether it's residential, whether it's transportation corridors, including railroads and roads. And it's a really difficult problem. And in the absence of additional sediment, these systems are likely to drown. And so we're going to lose a lot of the ecosystem services that they provide with no upland location to migrate to. Next slide, please. So we've really, along with a number of partners and other people are pursuing this line as well, as we're trying to seek innovative ways of envisioning the future, what the future could look like using augmented reality, virtual reality, for example. This is one example that Sea Grant led in Santa Monica, and you can click through a couple slides here where they put up this so-called ALEC, a telescope, to look into the future, well, first of all, what the present day looks like, where the shoreline used to be a century ago when there's lots of sand dumped on the beach, and then what the future will look like with sea level rise. You can click through again. What the future will look like with sea level rise plus storms, but then thinking strategically about what a greener future could look like. Next slide, please. And look at a possible solution that could really have both benefits to the local jurisdiction, beachgoers, ecology, et cetera. So there's lots of ways to move forward to do this thoughtfully and to hopefully not sacrifice too much of our livelihoods and our ecosystems in the process. Next slide, please. So lastly, just there's a lot of ongoing work in this area. We, USGS, and a lot of partners across the state and beyond are working with stakeholders to support regional and local policy and coastal management decision-making. One such example is currently we're developing a concept with UC Santa Cruz called Cosmos Adapt, which presents all these different, or a number of different gray to green solutions across the state and look at the impacts of those different actions. What if we went gray? What if we instead nourished beaches? What if we built up berms? How will those play out down the road? So trying to put some of these tools into the hands of decision makers instead of just delivering the worst case scenario. Let's talk about all the different possible management actions that can support these areas. No doubt more actionable science is needed, more interdisciplinary science. We're finally starting to get there. One of the big realizations I think in the scientific community has been that we're very poor communicators in general. The denier community is much better than we are. They repeat the same message over and over and over again, and it has a way of sticking. And so scientists have realized we have to be much more outspoken about the observations and the science itself, and not be so conservative and just to throw academic papers out there and stand back. And need innovative ways of delivering the science and communicating, understanding what the communities all need. And so there's a much more of a appreciation of social science in the physical science world now. And then lastly, from the top down, community resilience and environmental justice is just a huge area of growth and interest, and lots of work going on in Interior. My bureau underneath that agency, but also across the federal government, the state, to address these issues. And and the realization that everybody needs to have an equal say in the future decision making. That's the last. You can just click one through. There's some links here if you want some more information, and happy to answer any questions or just get out of the way of taking a few extra minutes. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Dr. Barnard. And Amy, this is still your report, so why don't you handle this next part of the commentary?
Great. And Mary Small is going to talk about the role of the Conservancy and other state agencies in addressing this. And yeah, thanks to Dr. Barnard for that presentation.
Should
Good
we
morning. Oh, do you want questions for Dr. Barnard right now? Or
I think
Yeah, I
we
was
should
just going to
have,
ask that. Should we?
I think first Mary should present, and then we can do consolidated comments.
Great. Well, thank you, and good morning, Chairman Bosco. This is just for staff. This is very disorienting. I'm not sure who I'm looking at, but oh, do I? And I can control my slides. Sorry, maybe. Try it. No, I cannot control my slides. Andrew, I should. Yeah, okay. It's just slow. Okay. Well, thank you. And I thought I would sort of start here. It's a little daunting to go after Patrick, but also a great opportunity. Amy asked me to give a really brief overview of sort of what the state is doing to respond to sea level rise and what the Coastal Conservancy's role is within that. And so this will be necessarily a very high level, quick summary of various roles. But sort of starting with just an aerial image, you could think of flying into any urban airport in California on the coast and looking out the window. You know, nobody is actually in charge of sea level rise. Sea level rise is going to have, as Patrick really just went through, so many impacts to individual landowners, to cities, to counties, to public infrastructure, to public natural resources, that it is a all hands on deck response. Everybody is going to have a role to play. And I'm going to really just focus on kind of what the state of California is doing. Okay, it does work. It just takes a while. You know, under the governor's office, the Office of Planning and Research and the Strategic Growth Council have really been charged with the state's response to climate change broadly and multiple climate impacts, including sea level rise. So those entities are providing funding, they are coordinating among different state agencies, and also providing some resource hubs of examples of case studies and consolidation of state data in a single place for people. And so they have a really high level coordinating role of all climate impacts, which of course many are related, but including sea level rise. But if we kind of focus more specifically on sea level rise, I think the state has several roles that it's playing. You know, one is, as Patrick just talked about, is supporting the basic science and making sure everyone has access to current real science and guidance about what we can expect along our coast and making that information available to all communities. Of course, the state owns a great deal of real estate and infrastructure that is going to be impacted by sea level rise. And so there are a number of agencies that are really focusing on that. Cal OES is responsible for coordinating with FEMA in terms of both emergency response and hazard planning. And I mean, ideally, we will do such a great job planning for sea level rise that we will never have an emergency response, but I think that's unlikely. And so, you know, we and the commission have been working to make sure that hazard mitigation planning is increasingly incorporating thinking about sea level rise. And Cal OES is really the leader in that. And then, of course, the state has a unique role in California in planning for land use along the coast and around San Francisco Bay through both BCDC and the Coastal Commission have a land use planning function and a regulatory approval process. And so that's a really strong lever through which the state has a say in what development looks like in the coast and how local communities are planning for sea level rise. Broadly and through a variety of agencies, I think the state has been really trying to support local governments and local communities in understanding the impacts and starting to plan for them. And then finally, and this, well, I'll go through it in a little bit quicker slides, but the coastal public resources, those shared resources of the coast, natural resources, public access resources, making sure that Patrick's scenario where we just don't have beaches, that we try and plan for a future where we are doing as much as we can to protect those resources going into the future. So, okay, it's quite a delay. Under the OPC and the Natural Resources Agency, under the new SIM administration, convened a state agency leadership group to develop sea level rise principles. And I know that board member Brownsy was very involved in making this happen. And that group first agreed on a set of principles and then developed a state sea level rise action plan. As Patrick talked about, OPC has also been involved going back more than a decade in developing kind of science for the state of California and kind of the state's official projections of what sea level rise will look like on our coast, and then updating that on a 5-year cycle. As I said, the Coastal Commission has land use and regulatory authority on the outer coast. So they have been developing a lot of guidance for local communities, providing funding for communities to update their local coastal plans, which are land use plans, to think about sea level rise. And then they have a really important regulatory permitting authority. And through that, I think they have helped encourage really innovative projects. The photos on the edge of the slide are the relocation of Highway 1 around Piedras Blancas that the commission really helped Caltrans to think about moving that highway inland. And that's a 3-mile section where we were able to retreat the infrastructure. Similarly, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission has that same regulatory and permitting authority around San Francisco Bay. And so they have also been working to develop guidance, to have planning efforts to bring together stakeholders and communities. And then they have a permitting authority for projects within the Bay. As I mentioned, there's a great deal of state-owned land. Come on, slides. Well, we might get there. Oh, and Andrew left me. Okay. What do I point at? Sorry, everybody. All right. Well, the state owns a great deal of land along the coast. Oh, well, I went past it. It doesn't matter. Who knows where I am now? Okay, we'll just stop there. It's a great picture. State parks. Oh, we're going to get all the way to the end now. Sorry. State parks owns about 1/4 of the coast. And of course, the State Lands Commission owns the state tidelands, which are generally defined as the mean high tide subtidal lands. So that's an ambulatory boundary, which is already moving. Both state parks is working on planning for sea level rise adaptation of their properties. And then State Lands Commission has leases to a lot of the state's ports, and they have been working with those lessees to develop sea level rise adaptation plans for those. Perfect, stop right there. Another role is state infrastructure. This is a photo of an aerial of Gleason's Beach in Sonoma County, another project where Caltrans is moving the highway inland in anticipation of, or in reaction really, to bluff failure that's sort of ongoing on that section of the Sonoma coast. Okay, so so that brings us to the Coastal Conservancy, if the slides advance, but okay, perfect. And our role in sea level rise adaptation, I think, is really a natural extension of our broader role in working along the coast. We were created to protect and enhance the natural resources of the coast and make sure that the public has access to them. We have had additions to our statute over the years to give us specific authority to work on climate adaptation. And as was discussed earlier, both funding and authority to really focus on nature-based sea level rise adaptation projects. And these are those kinds of projects that Patrick touched on, where we are trying to use natural systems to help increase the resiliency of the coast, the ability of the coast to withstand the impacts of sea level rise. And I wanted to, this is a picture of our Living Shorelines projects in San Rafael, where we're piloting restoration of eelgrass and oysters, and really looking at whether that restoration of that subtidal habitat can also attenuate wave energy and reduce erosion along the bay shore. And I wanted to really acknowledge one of the roles I think our staff play. I was thinking about this morning, is that we have really been critical in helping pilot some of these approaches that have not been tried yet in California, and really providing both funding and project management and technical expertise to encourage local governments and local partners to put these projects in the ground, to do the science, to see how they perform, learn from that, and hopefully expand their adoption. And I would say certainly the Living Shoreline work in California would not have happened without Coastal Conservancy staff. And a number of the examples I'm going to go through, I know personally that the local governments were not willing to do those projects until our staff convinced them to try. And I think that's a really critical role that the Conservancy plays. We have funded a number of regional and statewide plans. These are all plans that really looked at habitat restoration in an era of sea level rise, and how do we restore wetlands, what's going to happen to coastal habitat statewide, and what are the sort of pathways through which we can do that restoration given sea level rise. We have also funded a number of community vulnerability assessments. We funded one right here in the city of Imperial Beach. The picture on the far edge, the opposite edge, is work that we did up in Humboldt Bay, where we provided support for actual mapping of the levees that define Humboldt Bay, and a really detailed assessment of the vulnerability of that whole region to future sea level rise. And then, as our board well knows, our real goal is to implement projects on the ground. And so this is a picture of Surfers Point Managed Retreat Project in Ventura. I think Patrick had the eroding coastline slide. This was eroding long before sea level rise really started impacting the coast, in part because of the dam upstream, which had stopped sediment flowing down the Ventura River. And initial attempts to protect the coast involved just adding more rock, which actually made the erosion worse. And then over many years, the community Surfrider really led it. Kara Kemmler on our staff really worked on this. They actually implemented a project to move the bike path and the parking inland and restore the dunes on the outer coast. And the next phase of that will continue that project down coast. And then the third phase of that project really is Matilaha Dam removal, which I know you're going to hear about today. But and that project has many benefits, but one of them is if we were to take that dam out, it would restore that sediment supply down coast and help stop that baseline erosion, which is causing impacts on top of the sea level rise impacts. We are really interested in better uses of dirt as part of our response to sea level rise, and this is the Seal Beach Sediment Augmentation Project. It was also a pilot project to test the idea of using dredge material and spreading it across a wetland that had subsided, and seeing if you could do it in a way without just like burying everything and killing it, but allowing that wetland to sort of accelerate what would be natural accretion and help keep that wetland more resilient to sea level rise. And so that was a project we did at the Seal Beach National Wildlife Refuge. And of course, I went through it fast, but we are working as quickly as we can to restore the wetlands in San Francisco Bay. And that is also in part because if we restore those wetlands quickly, they will be able to accrete more dirt and grow, and they will have a better chance of surviving as sea levels rise. And this is just a sort of broadly our concept of using wetlands as part of sea level rise adaptation, is that the wetlands and the outboard of whatever protection you need can help reduce that wave energy and make the coast or the shoreline more resilient by having that wetland as a dynamic system on the outboard. Then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about Cardiff Dunes, which is just up the coast here. The picture on the left is before we did the project. This is a stretch of Highway 1 right at Cardiff State Beach, and it was protected with a bunch of riprap, and waves were overtopping Highway 1. And this is another one I will really say that our staff were able to convince the city, which is responsible for Highway 1, to rather than just add more riprap, to build the dunes on the outboard with some protection underneath. And so that's what the project looked like after it was constructed. And then here are some photos of what the project looked like after the first set of storms and after the second set of storms in January. And we're going to hear from our partners later this month, but I think our general impression is that it worked broadly, but the dunes did erode pretty dramatically in those storms. And dunes are designed to do that, and so hopefully we can restore those dunes and put the sand back to have it function in the future. And I think it's important, we're still collecting, I think, information about the impacts of the January storms to a lot of our projects. This is a slide of the Point Pinos coastal trail that we all visited in December. And it also suffered some erosion, but also seems to have largely survived. And that is also a project that was both designed so that most of the impacts, doesn't look great, but most of the impacts, according to the city, were just like sand overwashing and not structural erosion of the trail. And I would remind the board that that's a project that we worked with the city to eventually, the plan is to have that trail move inland because we know it will need to retreat at some point. And then the last slide I wanted to show, this is a picture that of Hare Ranch, which is an acquisition we funded in the San Pablo Baylands that filled up with water and ducks in the January slides and January storms. And it reminded me, there was a great article in the Chronicle about how the city of Napa didn't flood during the January storms. And for those of you who are old enough to remember, the city of Napa used to flood all the time. And it was a great article, except it did not credit the Coastal Conservancy, which really played an important role in planning with the city for an alternative and convincing the Army Corps to take an alternative approach to flooding. Instead of doing a channelized, the Army Corps wanted to do its concrete channel kind of system through the city. And we funded a lot of the early modeling to show that you could actually do wetland restoration and floodplain restoration and reduce those flood elevations in the city. And then we spent decades buying property and restoring property along the edge of the Napa River. And that's one that actually, you don't hear about the storms, the things that didn't flood in the storms. And so that's one that actually worked out well. And that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Mary. And yeah.